All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about doing pair plots and I'm going to talk about doing joint plots because I feel like they're kind of doing similar things. They're both ways of kind of looking at multiple different sets of data, kind of looking at the intersection of multiple sets of data and seeing either looking at them their individual distributions, then also how their kind of scatter plots go to come together, how they intersect. So in this one, we're looking at these three variables from our serial data, and we're creating this pair plot. So we're going to see like actually only half this table is really going to be meaningful because the other half should be a mirror image. So really what we're looking at here is like this is our we have plots within plots. On the y-axis here, we have the three variables that we're looking at within our serials, and we're also going to have the same thing across the bottom here. Where these two intersect, so if we look at like fat and fat, we're going to see right here, this is going to be a distribution of values. It just gives us a sense of, I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers on this one. It's just giving us more sense of like how the data is just distributed. But however, where we intersect with things like fat and calories, we can see in this case it's going to be a bit of like this is a scatter chart. This might be better. Maybe I'm gonna make a new one real quick using the fact book because I feel like that has a lot more data to spread out. So let's look at some things in there. So for this, I'm just gonna copy and paste the code in here. It's gonna be updating this notebook as we go. Let's run in here. I'd really like to see. Let's see what columns we have to choose from. Let's choose like 3 columns that might be interesting to look at. Let's look at like HIV, AIDS. Let's look at that as one of our columns. Let's see what else can we have in here. Hopefully get this all to work. Let's see what else we might look at. I'll look at like infant mortality rate. Very happy things, not kind of little morbid things to look at, but let's just look at maybe some negative indicators for a country. So we'll look at like infant mortality rate. Let's do death rate. All right, so easy as that. I get these 3 in here. Let's do our show plot. Let's see what we get. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. We can see kind of how these are related. I guess maybe HIV, AIDS, death is quite low on the spectrum here. This is kind of interesting. Maybe death rate and infant mortality is kind of again, a little bit of a bummer, but it's a kind of interesting connection to make. Like just seeing how these distributions look different or how these scatter plots look different based on how these things intersect. In this case, I think just in general, like this value is quite low, which is a great thing. But it doesn't also kind of skews this data to be a little bit more towards just the left side because there's just so few values in here. But we can see like when we compare like death rate, infant mortality, we're getting like slightly more interesting graphs in here. Let's change out AIDS for something else. Well, let's do something. Let's look at GDP per capita. Just basically how rich someone is, how rich a country is versus some of these like health factors. Let's try that. Okay, I don't want to make this take too long, but I think we just see some more interesting things. Okay, interesting. So we have a lot of low values on here. I think already being able to look from one to another, we can see like how this data shifts a little bit. We still have a lot of kind of very interesting, like a lot of concentration towards the low end. I think for both of these graphs, like this means like in general countries are quite poor, but on the bottom here we're seeing infant mortality is also quite low. Let's see. Yeah, I wish we could kind of zoom in on this a little bit. I guess what I'm seeing here, this looks to me like kind of like a logarithmic graph. I think if we could kind of maybe get a line of best fit in here, we could see that like as GDP, like infant mortality rates rapidly decrease as our GDP increases. So we have kind of, I think if we drew in a line, we'd have some sort of regression line that looks like this. It says in the poorest countries we have like the highest levels of infant mortality, but as our GDP increases just slightly, we're more further along this curve, and we don't really see any data that's kind of out over here. There's not a lot of countries with a high GDP per capita where we have high infant mortality rates. It might be interesting to look at some of these not quite outlier, but kind of distinct pieces of data out here. But it is kind of interesting that this actually does form a pretty strong pattern here. What else can we look at here? Like GDP, like death rates, and like if we compare these two, this is a very strong. Like I think you could really draw a line here very quickly to form this. It's kind of interesting. So we do have some countries that have very low infant mortality, even with low GDP. So it's kind of interesting about that kind of relationship there. But if we compare that then to death rates per capita, death rate versus GDP, like see there's less of like a really clear, strong relationship between these two. I mean, this seems like there's a very clear curve here. There's a little bit more of a distribution here. Um, yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I wonder if maybe we could look at like healthcare or something like what's going on here that makes this data so much different than this because they're kind of measuring the same thing. How healthy are you as a relationship of your it's two measures of trying to set how healthy a country is based on their wealth. So, but getting two different outcomes.